The Tudor era, an age of powerful monarchs, sweeping reforms, dazzling courtly splendor, and profound change, continues to captivate our imagination centuries later. From the infamous reign of Henry VIII to the iconic rule of Elizabeth I, this remarkable period in English history laid the groundwork for the modern world. But beyond the towering figures of royalty and the grandeur of the court, the lives of ordinary people, the shifting dynamics of religion and power, and the legacy left behind tell an even richer story. It was an age of contradictions, brilliance and brutality, innovation and oppression, ambition and artistry. Welcome to Words of Time. In this video we'll journey deep into the legacy of the Tudors, exploring how their reign transformed English society, reshaped the world stage, and left an indelible mark on culture, politics, and history. Whether you're a history enthusiast or just curious about the past, you're in for a compelling exploration of one of the most fascinating chapters in England's story. Let's dive in. Life beyond the court during the Tudor era, which spanned from 1485 to 1603, was vastly different from the opulence and political machinations that characterized the royal household. While the court dazzled with its wealth, fashion, and power plays, the majority of England's population lived under far harsher and more modest circumstances. Their lives were shaped by the land, the seasons, social hierarchies, religion, and a constant battle against disease, poverty, and uncertainty. The Tudor period was one of immense transformation, and while these changes ushered in moments of progress and growth, they also led to widespread suffering and social tension. Most people in Tudor England were poor. The economic structure was primarily agrarian, with the vast majority of the population living in rural areas and working the land as farmers or laborers. Farming was not just an occupation, it was a way of life. Families worked together to till the soil, sow crops, tend to animals, and gather food for both sustenance and trade. The daily rhythm of life was dictated by the agricultural calendar, with hard labor during planting and harvest seasons and relative quiet during winter. Life on the land was demanding. Tools were rudimentary, medical knowledge was limited, and any disruption, such as bad weather or poor harvests, could lead to famine or starvation. Social hierarchy was deeply entrenched in Tudor society. At the bottom were laborers, servants, and beggars, many of whom struggled to find regular work. Above them were yeomen and husbandmen, small landowners or prosperous farmers who enjoyed a modest level of comfort and autonomy. The gentry and nobility occupied the upper levels of society, owning large estates and often exerting influence over the lives of those who lived on their lands. Mobility between these classes was limited, though not entirely impossible. Education and wealth could sometimes help an ambitious individual climb the social ladder, but this was rare and often met with resistance. Urban life was emerging as towns and cities began to grow, particularly London, which was expanding rapidly. However, life in towns was not necessarily easier. While opportunities for trade and crafts were greater, urban poverty was just as widespread as rural hardship. The streets of cities were often dirty and overcrowded. Sanitation was poor, and waste frequently flowed through open drains or was dumped into the streets. Disease spread quickly in such conditions. Outbreaks of plague, typhus, and smallpox were common, and there was little understanding of how these illnesses spread. The average life expectancy was low, and death was a constant presence. Education during the Tudor period began to grow in importance, especially following the spread of humanist ideas and the Reformation. Boys from wealthy families were often sent to grammar schools or tutored privately. Girls' education was far more limited and usually focused on preparing them for domestic responsibilities. For most children of the lower classes, education was a luxury they could not afford. Instead, they learned practical skills from a young age and were expected to contribute to the family economy, either on the farm or by entering apprenticeships or service in wealthier households. Religion played a central role in the lives of Tudor people. The period was marked by religious upheaval, beginning with Henry VIII's break from the Roman Catholic Church and the establishment of the Church of England. This shift caused tremendous instability, as the country swung back and forth between Catholicism and Protestantism under different monarchs. For ordinary people, this could be confusing and dangerous. Allegiances could shift quickly, and failure to adhere to the prevailing religious doctrine could lead to imprisonment, torture, or execution. Despite this, religion provided structure and comfort to many. The church was the center of community life, hosting celebrations, rituals, and gatherings. Women's lives during the Tudor era were largely shaped by their roles as daughters, wives, and mothers. Their primary responsibilities revolved around the home: cooking, cleaning, raising children, and managing household affairs. Marriage was often a matter of economic necessity rather than love, and women had little say in the choice of their partners. Dowries, property rights, and inheritance laws reinforced male dominance. Widows had slightly more freedom, sometimes managing estates or businesses, but they still operated within a patriarchal system. Despite this, women contributed significantly to the economy through their work in the home, in the fields, or as seamstresses, midwives, and market sellers. Crime and punishment in the Tudor period were harsh and public. The justice system was designed not only to punish but to deter. Thieves, beggars, and those accused of treason or heresy could expect brutal sentences, including flogging, branding, mutilation, or execution. Public hangings, burnings, and beheadings were common and often attended by large crowds. These events served both as warnings and as grim forms of entertainment. The idea of rehabilitation was almost non-existent. Poor laws were enacted to deal with the growing number of destitute people, leading to workhouses and penal transportation in later years. Despite the hardships, there was also a sense of community and resilience. Local festivals, fairs, and market days were moments of joy and social bonding. Music, storytelling, and games brought color and levity to lives otherwise burdened by toil. Seasonal celebrations such as May Day, harvest festivals, and Christmas were eagerly anticipated. In many villages, the church bell marked the hours of the day and called people to worship or community meetings. People relied on one another for survival, sharing resources, labor, and knowledge. Food for most people was simple and seasonal. Bread, pottage, a thick vegetable stew, and ale formed the basis of many meals. Meat was a luxury more common among the wealthy, though poorer families might keep a pig or hunt small game. Preservation methods were basic salting, drying, or smoking, and fresh produce was only available in season. Hunger and malnutrition were persistent problems, particularly in years of poor harvest. Yet people made do with what they had, and food customs reflected regional diversity and agricultural rhythms. Clothing in Tudor England reflected one's social status. The poor wore garments made of coarse wool or linen, often in drab colors. Their clothing was practical, designed for work and protection from the elements. Wealthier individuals, especially those at court, wore elaborate outfits made of silk, velvet, and fine embroidery. Sumptuary laws regulated what people could wear based on their social class, reinforcing distinctions of rank. Tailoring was a skilled trade, and local markets or fairs provided opportunities for buying, selling, and repairing clothes and textiles. The changing economy also affected life beyond the court. The enclosure movement, which saw common lands fenced off for private use, disrupted traditional farming practices and displaced many rural families. This led to increasing urban migration and a rise in the number of landless laborers and vagrants. Inflation and the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII further strained resources. The monasteries had been major providers of charity, education, and health care, and their loss created a vacuum in social support. The government struggled to address these issues, leading to the implementation of various poor laws aimed at controlling and assisting the needy. Art and culture were not confined to the elite. While the court patronized great works of literature, music, and portraiture, the broader population engaged with culture in their own ways. Mystery plays, folk songs, ballads, and oral storytelling were popular forms of entertainment. These cultural expressions preserved communal values, historical memory, and a sense of identity. Traveling performers brought theater to towns and villages, and the rise of the printing press made literature more accessible, though literacy remained low among the general population. Trade and exploration began to shape life in new ways. England's growing maritime ambitions under Henry VIII and Elizabeth I opened the country to new goods, ideas, and conflicts. Spices, cloth, and other imports made their way into markets, changing consumption patterns. Some merchants grew rich, and towns that engaged in trade expanded in size and importance. This emerging mercantile class challenged traditional notions of status and contributed to the gradual evolution of a capitalist economy. However, these changes also brought exploitation and inequality, both at home and abroad. Children in Tudor England faced a difficult upbringing, particularly among the poor. From a young age, they were expected to contribute to the household economy. Many entered service or apprenticeships in their early teens, and childhood as a distinct phase of life was scarcely recognized. Infant mortality was high, and families often had many children in the hope that some would survive to adulthood. Games, songs, and simple toys offered brief respite from daily labor, and religious instruction was an integral part of their upbringing. The natural world was both a resource and a mystery to Tudor people. Superstition and folklore played a large role in daily life. Beliefs in witches, spirits, and omens were widespread, and natural phenomena were often interpreted through a religious or magical lens. Wise women and cunning men acted as healers and advisors in many communities, blending herbal knowledge with folk beliefs. The boundaries between science, religion, and superstition were fluid, and people sought meaning and control in a world full of uncertainties. Although the court was the epicenter of political power, its influence extended far into the countryside. Royal policies, religious decrees, and taxation schemes filtered down through a network of officials, sheriffs, and justices of the peace. These representatives of the crown enforced laws and maintained order, often clashing with local traditions and interests. The tension between central authority and local autonomy was a defining feature of Tudor governance and shaped the everyday experiences of many subjects. War and conflict also impacted life beyond the court. Military campaigns against Scotland, France, and later Spain led to increased taxation and conscription. Men were recruited into the army or navy, often unwillingly, and their absence strained families and communities. Raids, piracy, and the threat of invasion, particularly during the reign of Elizabeth I, kept people in a state of unease. Yet there was also national pride and a growing sense of English identity, fueled by successes like the defeat of the Spanish Armada and the exploits of explorers such as Francis Drake. Life beyond the court in Tudor England was complex, challenging, and constantly evolving. While the royal court captured the attention of chroniclers and artists, it represented only a tiny fraction of the population. For the vast majority of people, life was marked by hard work, limited resources, deep faith, and resilience in the face of adversity. The changes of the Tudor era, religious reform, economic shifts, urbanization, and the rise of a market economy left lasting marks on the social fabric. Though often overshadowed by the grandeur of monarchs and courtiers, the experiences of ordinary men, women, and children formed the true backbone of the Tudor story. In Tudor England, the rhythms of daily life were shaped largely by one's work and social class, and for the vast majority of the population, life revolved around labor. The grandeur of the royal court or the affairs of the nobility may dominate historical records, but the fabric of society was woven from the lives of ordinary people, farmers, laborers, and artisans who lived in rural villages and worked from dawn until dusk to survive. Their existence was governed not by politics or luxury but by the pressing needs of daily sustenance, communal obligations, and the ever-present challenges posed by nature, health, and social hierarchy. Most people during the Tudor period lived in small, self-sufficient villages scattered throughout the countryside. These communities were tightly knit, with each member contributing in some way to the local economy and social fabric. Life was predominantly agrarian, and farming was the cornerstone of existence. Whether they were tenants on a lord's land, freeholders with small plots, or hired hands working for others, rural families toiled in the fields throughout the year. Seasons dictated their labor. Spring was for planting, summer for tending crops, autumn for harvest, and winter for maintenance and preparation. There was little respite. Even during the colder months, there was wood to chop, tools to mend, animals to care for, and clothes to sew. Work was often shared among all members of a household. Children assisted from a young age, learning to herd animals, gather firewood, fetch water, and perform other vital chores. Women played a crucial role, not only managing the home but also contributing significantly to agricultural work. They milked cows, churned butter, plucked poultry, tended kitchen gardens, and even helped with sowing and harvesting when needed. Men typically undertook heavier tasks such as plowing, managing livestock, building structures, and traveling to markets. This collective approach to labor was not merely a necessity but a cultural norm. Survival depended on every member fulfilling their role, and interdependence was key to enduring the relentless demands of rural life. The day began early, often before sunrise, with prayers and a modest breakfast, commonly consisting of coarse bread and ale. Meals were simple and designed to fuel hard work. Pottage, made from grains and vegetables, was a staple, and meat was rare for the poor. The diet was seasonal and based largely on what could be grown, raised, or gathered locally. The absence of refrigeration and the high cost of imported goods meant that preservation methods, salting, drying, pickling, were essential for making food last through leaner months. Hunger was not uncommon, particularly in years of poor harvest, when bad weather or crop disease could decimate food supplies. Daily routines were punctuated by religious observance, as faith was deeply ingrained in the rhythms of work and life. Church attendance was mandatory and served not only as a spiritual duty but as a social gathering. Holy days, feast days, and saints' days offered brief reprieves from work and moments of communal celebration, though these were often accompanied by obligations such as fasting, processions, or charitable acts. Religion provided a framework for understanding suffering, mortality, and the moral order of the world, offering hope amid a life often marked by difficulty. Illness was a constant threat, and medical knowledge was rudimentary. Few people had access to trained physicians, and even when they did, treatments were based on theories now understood to be ineffective or harmful. Herbal remedies, folk practices, and the counsel of local wise women, or healers, were more commonly relied upon. Disease could strike swiftly and without warning, and epidemics like the plague were recurrent. Poor sanitation, crowded living conditions, and limited access to clean water exacerbated the spread of illness. Infant mortality was high, and many children did not survive to adulthood. Adults, too, could be struck down in their prime, leaving families to grapple not only with grief but with the economic hardship that often followed the loss of a worker. Despite the hardships, there was pride in work, especially in the practice of traditional crafts. Artisans such as blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers, potters, and coopers were essential to village life. Their skills were passed down through generations, often from parent to child, and apprenticeships were a key means of learning a trade. These craftspeople played crucial roles in their communities, producing the tools, furniture, clothing, and household goods that were otherwise unavailable. Markets and fairs provided opportunities to trade surplus goods and acquire necessary items, and while currency was used, barter remained a common practice in many areas. Life was governed by necessity and luxury was rare. Clothing was functional, made of wool or linen, and homes were simple, usually consisting of 1 or 2 rooms. Floors were made of dirt or stone, and windows, if present, were small and covered with oiled cloth or shutters. Heating came from a central hearth, which also served for cooking. Light was provided by candles or rushlights. Despite the austerity, households often had a strong sense of order and custom. Roles were clearly defined, and rules about behavior, respect, and responsibility were strictly enforced. Work did not end with the setting sun. Though daylight was the primary time for labor, many tasks continued into the evening, repairing equipment, spinning wool, mending clothing, or preparing food for the next day. Leisure was scarce and usually integrated into social and religious events. Storytelling, singing, dancing, and games were occasional pleasures, often enjoyed around the fire after a long day's work. Community bonds were reinforced through these shared moments of rest and celebration. Urban life offered a different, though equally demanding, set of routines. Towns and cities were hubs for trade, governance, and specialized labor. Artisans formed guilds that regulated training, quality, and competition within various trades. Markets buzzed with activity, drawing people from surrounding countryside to buy, sell, and socialize. However, life in towns could be even more perilous than in rural areas due to higher population density, unsanitary conditions, and the rapid spread of disease. Housing was cramped, streets were narrow and unpaved, and waste disposal was primitive. Still, urban dwellers had greater access to goods, services, and sometimes education, although these benefits were not evenly distributed. For the working poor, employment could be irregular. Many served as day laborers or itinerant workers, moving from job to job based on demand. Others found work in domestic service for wealthier households. While this provided shelter and food, it also meant strict rules, long hours, and little personal freedom. Some worked in proto-industrial roles such as spinning, weaving, or tanning, often from their own homes. These cottage industries were vital to the economy and laid the foundation for later industrial developments. Yet they too required long hours and brought minimal financial reward. Women's labor was largely undervalued but indispensable. In addition to domestic responsibilities, many women earned supplemental income through spinning, brewing ale, raising poultry, or working as midwives or healers. In cities, some women worked as seamstresses, laundresses, or street vendors. Despite their contributions, legal and cultural norms limited their rights. They could not vote, had limited property rights, and were expected to defer to male authority in all spheres. Widowhood occasionally provided a woman with more autonomy, especially if she inherited property or a business, but these cases were exceptions rather than the rule. Children were viewed as economic contributors from an early age. Formal schooling was limited and generally reserved for the sons of wealthier families. For most children, education consisted of practical instruction in the skills needed for adulthood: farming, cooking, craftwork, and religious practice. Some boys entered apprenticeships, learning trades that would support them for life. Girls were often trained in domestic skills to prepare for marriage and motherhood. The idea of a prolonged, protected childhood did not exist for most. Rather, children were integrated into the labor force as soon as they were physically capable. The structure of work was rigidly hierarchical, and opportunities for advancement were limited. A person's occupation and status were often inherited, and mobility between classes was rare. However, exceptions did occur, especially during times of social upheaval or economic expansion. A talented craftsman might rise through a guild, a successful merchant could accumulate wealth and influence, and an ambitious family might send a son to study and enter the clergy or legal profession. These upward movements were difficult and fraught with obstacles, but they introduced the idea of merit-based advancement that would become more prominent in later centuries. As England transitioned from the medieval to the early modern period, economic changes began to reshape daily life. The enclosure movement privatized common lands, pushing many small farmers off the land and into wage labor or urban centers. This disruption caused significant hardship, breaking apart traditional village economies and increasing the number of vagrants and beggars. The dissolution of the monasteries further strained social welfare, as these institutions had provided food, shelter, and employment for many. In response, the government enacted poor laws, which attempted to distinguish between the deserving and undeserving poor, offering minimal assistance to the former while punishing the latter. Technological innovations, though slow and incremental, began to alter the nature of work. The increased use of watermills, improvements in metal tools, and the spread of printed materials facilitated new forms of labor and communication. Yet for the average worker, the day-to-day experience remained rooted in manual effort and communal interdependence. Life was shaped by necessity, habit, and tradition, with change coming gradually and often painfully. Community played a central role in sustaining people through their laborious lives. Mutual aid, neighborly cooperation, and shared rituals helped ease the burdens of work. Villages operated with a degree of self-governance, with local customs, rules, and leaders guiding the distribution of land, resolution of disputes, and organization of communal tasks. These networks of support were critical, particularly in times of crisis, when illness, famine, or misfortune could strike without warning. As the Tudor era progressed, literacy and education began to spread, particularly with the influence of the Reformation and the printing press. More people gained access to religious texts and practical knowledge, which in turn affected work habits, self-discipline, and social expectations. The emphasis on individual reading and moral improvement dovetailed with emerging values of industriousness and thrift, laying the groundwork for a more disciplined and regulated labor force in the centuries to come. Leisure, while limited, still had its place. Festivals, fairs, and church holidays offered chances to rest, socialize, and engage in games, dancing, and sports. These events often featured contests of strength, music, feasting, and performances. They were eagerly anticipated and served as important outlets for joy and expression in otherwise difficult lives. Some forms of leisure also reinforced work-related skills. Archery practice, for example, was encouraged by law due to its military utility. Though their lives were marked by hardship, the working people of Tudor England displayed remarkable endurance and adaptability. They carried forward traditions, developed new practices, and maintained social cohesion in the face of adversity. Their labor built the foundation of the Tudor economy, supported the elite, and enabled the cultural achievements of the era. Without their effort, persistence, and collective knowledge, the grandeur of the period's politics and arts would not have been possible. At the heart of their lives was a deep connection to the land, the seasons, and the community. Every task, from milking a cow to weaving a basket, carried meaning beyond its utility. It linked individuals to their ancestors, neighbors, and the rhythms of the world around them. Even as political and religious storms raged in the background, these workers maintained a continuity that grounded Tudor society. Their world was not one of luxury or ease, but it was rich in purpose, relationship, and resilience, a testament to the enduring human capacity to find meaning and dignity in work. In Tudor England, the daily experience of food and clothing was deeply influenced by one's social position, with marked contrasts between the diets and dress of the wealthy and the poor. While the royal court displayed extravagant meals and luxurious fashions, the vast majority of the population led modest lives, eating simple meals and wearing practical garments. These elements, food and clothing, were not merely about sustenance or protection from the elements. They reflected cultural values, economic conditions, religious beliefs, and social hierarchies. The food people consumed and the clothing they wore said much about who they were, where they stood in society, and how they related to the world around them. For most Tudor people, daily food was dictated by necessity, availability, and season. Bread was a central part of the diet across all social classes, but the type of bread consumed varied greatly. The poor typically ate coarse, dark bread made from rye or barley, often dense and tough. In contrast, the wealthy enjoyed finer white bread made from wheat flour, which was more expensive and refined. This distinction in bread alone was a clear indicator of social status, visible on every table and tasted in every bite. Vegetables played a significant role in the diets of common people, who relied heavily on homegrown produce to supplement their meals. Cabbage, leeks, onions, turnips, and beans were among the most commonly consumed. These were usually cooked into pottage, a thick stew that might include grains and, when available, a bit of meat or bone for flavor. Pottage was a daily staple, easy to make in large quantities and adaptable to whatever ingredients were at hand. Herbs from kitchen gardens such as parsley, sage, thyme, and mint were used to season food, adding flavor in the absence of more exotic spices. Meat, though associated with wealth and status, was also eaten by the lower classes when they could afford it or raise it themselves. Pork was the most commonly available meat for rural families, and animals were often slaughtered and preserved in the autumn to last through the winter. Preservation techniques such as salting, smoking, and drying were essential. Wild game like rabbits or deer was technically reserved for the nobility, but poaching was common, and many poorer households occasionally enjoyed what they could catch or trap. Eggs, dairy products, and fish also supplemented diets, with freshwater fish like pike, perch, and eels more common inland, and salted or dried sea fish such as cod and herring consumed widely, especially on religious fasting days. For the nobility and gentry, food was both sustenance and spectacle. Large households employed professional cooks, and meals could be grand affairs with multiple courses. The Tudor elite consumed a wider variety of meats, including venison, beef, lamb, swan, and even peacock. They had access to imported spices like cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and pepper, which were expensive and therefore prestigious. Sugar, though available, was costly and used mostly in the preparation of sweet dishes and preserves. Fruits, often stewed or baked into pies, were enjoyed more in the summer and autumn. Banquets included elaborately presented dishes, sculpted sugar creations, meat pies shaped like animals, and jelly molded into elaborate shapes. Such meals were designed to impress and assert status as much as to satisfy hunger. Religious observance shaped eating habits across all classes. The Catholic Church imposed fasting days, particularly on Fridays and during Lent, when meat was forbidden. Instead, people turned to fish, dairy, and vegetable dishes. Even after the Reformation altered the religious landscape, many traditional food customs remained ingrained in daily practice. These customs not only influenced what people ate but when and how they ate it, weaving food into the fabric of communal and spiritual life. Clothing, like food, was both functional and symbolic. For the poor and working classes, clothing had to withstand the rigors of daily labor and exposure to the elements. Materials were practical and locally sourced, primarily wool, linen, and leather. Wool was the most commonly used fabric, spun and woven at home or by local weavers. It provided warmth and durability, essential for those who worked outdoors in varying weather conditions. Linen, made from flax, was used for undergarments and shirts, as it was more comfortable against the skin. Leather was used for shoes, belts, aprons, and protective gear. Garments for the lower classes were simple in design and construction. Men typically wore woolen tunics or jerkins over linen shirts, with breeches or hose and leather shoes. Women wore long gowns or kirtles with aprons and linen caps or coifs to cover their hair. Outerwear, such as cloaks or mantles, was worn for warmth and often passed down through generations. Clothing was mended, repurposed, and reused until it could no longer be worn. Most people owned only a few sets of clothes, with a best outfit reserved for Sundays, church, or special occasions. In contrast, the wealthy used clothing to display their status, taste, and even political allegiance. The fashions of the court were elaborate, often imported or inspired by continental Europe, particularly Spain and Italy. Rich fabrics such as velvet, silk, satin, and fine linen were favored, and garments were adorned with embroidery, lace, jewels, and elaborate trims. Colors were bold and symbolic. Deep reds, purples, and golds indicated wealth and power. The cost of dyes and fabrics meant that only the elite could afford such displays, and laws known as sumptuary laws restricted the wearing of certain colors and materials to those of particular ranks. Women of the upper classes wore tightly fitted bodices, wide skirts supported by farthingales, and high ruffled collars called ruffs. Gowns were layered over chemises and petticoats, often with detachable sleeves that could be changed to match different ensembles. Men wore doublets, hose, and cloaks, with padded shoulders and codpieces giving a distinctive silhouette. Hats, gloves, and jewelry completed the look. Fashion was a language of status, and following the trends set by royalty was a means of demonstrating loyalty and refinement. These distinctions in clothing were not merely decorative, they reinforced social hierarchies and order. One could often tell at a glance someone's social standing by their dress. Servants wore the livery of their masters, marking their role and allegiance. Apprentices and laborers dressed according to their trade and economic means. The idea of dressing above one's station was frowned upon and sometimes legally punished. Clothing, in this context, served as a visible expression of the rigid structure of Tudor society. The production of clothing was itself a labor-intensive process, involving several stages and often multiple people. Spinning, weaving, dyeing, cutting, and sewing were all essential steps. In rural homes, many of these tasks were done within the family. Women spun wool into yarn, men wove it into cloth, and garments were made or repaired by hand. In towns and cities, specialized trades emerged. Tailors, mercers, dyers, and embroiderers formed guilds, which regulated training and ensured quality. The textile industry was one of the most important sectors of the Tudor economy, and its growth contributed to the development of urban centers and trade networks. Laundry was a laborious chore, especially since clothing was washed infrequently due to the difficulty of the task and the wear it placed on garments. Linen underclothes helped absorb sweat and could be washed more regularly, while outer garments might go weeks without cleaning. Clothes were scrubbed by hand with lye soap, rinsed, beaten, and laid out to dry on hedges or grass. In wealthier households, laundry was done by servants, while poorer women often did their own or offered laundering services to others as a source of income. The way people dressed also reflected regional and cultural differences. Rural communities maintained older styles longer than urban centers, and local traditions influenced design and materials. Some areas were known for particular types of cloth or embroidery. As trade increased, new materials and styles began to spread more widely, influencing both elite and popular fashions. The increasing availability of printed books and woodcut illustrations also helped disseminate images of fashionable dress, allowing people to imitate trends even if they could not afford the real thing. Children's clothing mimicked adult styles, though simplified for practicality. Infants were swaddled tightly in strips of cloth, believed to help their limbs grow straight. Young boys and girls wore similar dresses until the age of 7, when boys would be breeched and begin wearing short trousers. As they grew, children's clothing gradually became more gender-specific and reflected their family's status and expectations. For wealthier children, miniature versions of adult garments were common, while poorer families often relied on hand-me-downs and homemade clothes. As the Tudor period progressed, clothing and diet were increasingly shaped by broader changes in society. The rise of a merchant class and the growth of towns created new opportunities for wealth and social mobility, and this was often reflected in personal appearance. People who had gained prosperity through trade or industry might emulate the styles of the nobility, prompting renewed efforts to enforce sumptuary laws. Similarly, the availability of new foods and ingredients from abroad, including spices, citrus fruits, and sugar, began to influence even middle-class diets, particularly in urban areas. The influence of the royal court on fashion remained strong throughout the Tudor period. Monarchs like Henry VIII and Elizabeth I were style icons, whose choices set the tone for what was fashionable. Henry's love of extravagant dress, fur, and jewelry inspired similar trends among courtiers. Elizabeth's elaborate gowns, powdered face, and ornate ruffs became emblematic of the late Tudor aesthetic. To appear at court or in royal favor, nobles had to invest heavily in their appearance, often leading to significant debt in pursuit of fashion. Food, too, was shaped by courtly influence. Banquets hosted by royalty or nobility featured lavish displays of culinary art, complete with sugar sculptures, gilded meats, and rare dishes. Cookbooks began to appear, offering instructions for preparing elaborate meals, though these were generally aimed at elite households. Recipes from this period reveal a fascination with sweet and savory combinations, complex spicing, and decorative presentation. Despite the cultural focus on excess among the elite, the majority of the population continued to live with limited resources. Hunger was a regular threat, especially during bad harvest years. Malnutrition, food shortages, and rising prices were frequent problems. The gap between rich and poor diets remained wide, and the burden of scarcity fell heaviest on the lower classes. Yet even in hardship, communities found ways to preserve their culinary traditions and maintain a sense of identity through the food they shared. Clothing and food were thus not only about survival, but about belonging, identity, and meaning. What one wore and what one ate conveyed information about origins, aspirations, and affiliations. These aspects of daily life reveal the complex interplay between economy, culture, and social order in Tudor England. The care invested in making garments or preparing meals speaks to the value placed on these tasks, even when resources were limited. Both food and clothing were also sites of change, reflecting the gradual transformation of English society. As new ideas, goods, and technologies entered the country, people adapted their practices, combining tradition with innovation. This slow but steady evolution set the stage for more significant changes in the centuries that followed. Whether clothed in homespun wool or rich silk, whether eating pottage or peacock, Tudor people lived in a world where food and clothing were central to the human experience. They labored over meals, stitched garments with care, and observed the social rules that governed appearance and etiquette. In doing so, they left behind a legacy that reveals not only the hardships of their age but also the creativity, resilience, and communal spirit that defined everyday life in one of England's most dynamic historical periods. Tudor society was shaped by a deeply entrenched system of hierarchy and inequality, where a person's social position determined almost every aspect of their life, from the kind of work they performed and the clothes they wore to the level of education they could hope to receive and the respect they were afforded by others. This rigid social order was not only maintained by tradition and law but also reinforced by the church and cultural norms that had developed over centuries. At the top stood the monarch and the nobility, followed by the gentry, merchants, skilled tradespeople, laborers, and at the very bottom, the poor and destitute. Movement between these classes was rare, and those born into poverty were likely to remain there, living lives marked by hardship, dependence, and limited opportunity. The monarch was not just the head of state but also the supreme authority in both political and spiritual matters, especially after the English Reformation. Kings and queens were believed to rule by divine right, appointed by God to govern the realm. This belief in divine monarchy contributed to a culture in which obedience to authority was not just a matter of survival, but of religious duty. The Tudor monarchs, particularly Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, commanded tremendous influence and set the tone for the rest of society, their preferences and policies rippling down through every layer of the population. Below the monarch were the nobility, a small but powerful class whose wealth was derived from land ownership. The nobility held extensive estates, often passed down through generations, and were responsible for governing their local regions, collecting rents, dispensing justice, and maintaining order. Many nobles had close ties to the royal court, providing advice and military support to the monarch. They lived in large manorial houses surrounded by servants and tenants, and their wealth allowed them to live in relative comfort, free from the daily struggles that plagued the lower classes. Their children received formal education, learned Latin and Greek, and were groomed to manage estates, serve in government, or hold positions in the church. Just below the nobility was the gentry, a rising class of wealthy landowners, professionals, and lesser aristocrats. They did not hold hereditary titles, but they played a critical role in local governance, often serving as justices of the peace, sheriffs, or members of parliament. The gentry were highly respected, and their ranks grew during the Tudor period due to the economic changes brought about by the dissolution of the monasteries and the redistribution of church lands. Many members of the gentry aspired to join the ranks of the nobility, and their growing influence marked a gradual shift in the balance of power within English society. Beneath the gentry were the merchants and tradespeople who formed the backbone of the urban economy. This group included shopkeepers, artisans, craftsmen, and skilled laborers who worked in towns and cities. Some merchants became wealthy through trade and commerce, especially in ports like London, Bristol, and Norwich. These individuals could afford to educate their children and invest in property, slowly climbing the social ladder. However, most tradespeople lived modestly, working long hours to support their families and struggling with fluctuating markets and limited protections against misfortune. The majority of Tudor people lived in rural areas and were part of the laboring poor. They worked as agricultural laborers, tenant farmers, or servants, earning just enough to survive. Their lives were governed by the rhythms of the seasons and the demands of their landlords. Most had little or no education, owned no land, and had few prospects for advancement. Illness, crop failure, or the death of a family member could plunge them into dire poverty. Entire families often worked together to scrape out a living, and child labor was common. For these individuals, social mobility was almost impossible, and their existence was one of endurance and resilience rather than ambition or hope. At the very bottom of the social hierarchy were the beggars, vagrants, and destitute, those without land, employment, or support. They were often treated with suspicion and contempt, viewed as morally deficient or lazy. Tudor laws were harsh toward the poor, with punishments ranging from public whipping to imprisonment for those caught begging without permission. Yet not all of the poor were idle or criminal. Many were victims of circumstance such as widows, orphans, or the sick and elderly. Parish relief and charitable giving offered some measure of support, but these resources were limited, and the poor relied heavily on the goodwill of others and their own ingenuity to survive. The Church was a central pillar of Tudor life, exerting influence over both public and private spheres. Before the Reformation, the Roman Catholic Church dominated spiritual and cultural life, with monasteries and churches serving as centers of worship, learning, and charity. The Church taught that salvation could be achieved through faith and good works, and it played a vital role in reinforcing social norms. The priesthood and monastic orders were not only religious vocations but also avenues of limited upward mobility for those who demonstrated piety and intellectual ability. Churches provided spiritual guidance, administered sacraments, and marked life's key milestones: birth, marriage, and death. With the Reformation and the establishment of the Church of England under Henry VIII, the religious landscape shifted dramatically. The monarch became the supreme head of the Church, and many traditional Catholic practices were abolished or altered. The dissolution of the monasteries resulted in the closure of hundreds of religious institutions and the seizure of their wealth, lands, and buildings by the crown and the nobility. This upheaval had profound social consequences, as monasteries had previously provided education, medical care, and charity for the poor. Their loss left a void that was not easily filled, contributing to increased hardship for the most vulnerable. Despite these changes, religion remained deeply embedded in daily life. Attendance at church was compulsory, and sermons were used to instruct the faithful on moral behavior, loyalty to the crown, and proper conduct. Religious festivals punctuated the calendar, providing both spiritual reflection and communal celebration. The Church also continued to enforce moral codes, with ecclesiastical courts dealing with matters such as adultery, blasphemy, and heresy. Religious conformity was not just expected, it was demanded, and failure to comply could result in fines, imprisonment, or worse. Under Mary I, Protestants were persecuted, while under Elizabeth I, Catholics faced harsh penalties. The religious turmoil of the era created a climate of fear and suspicion, where private belief could have public consequences. Education during the Tudor period was limited and uneven, reflecting the broader inequalities of society. For the majority of the population, especially in rural areas, formal schooling was out of reach. Most children, particularly girls, received little to no education beyond what they learned at home. Instead, they were expected to contribute to household labor from an early age, acquiring practical skills rather than academic knowledge. Literacy rates were low, and reading was seen as a luxury or a skill for those whose roles required it. Where schools did exist, they were usually connected to the church. Grammar schools, often founded by religious institutions or endowed by wealthy patrons, provided instruction in Latin, the Bible, and classical texts. These schools were intended primarily for boys of the gentry or merchant class, preparing them for university, government service, or clerical positions. Education was rigorous and heavily focused on rote learning and discipline. Corporal punishment was common, and students were expected to memorize long passages of scripture and classical literature. For the sons of the nobility, private tutors were often employed to provide a tailored education at home. These boys studied languages, history, rhetoric, philosophy, and theology, as well as fencing, music, and courtly manners. Education was a mark of status, and an educated gentleman was better equipped to serve in court, diplomacy, or the law. Girls from noble families also received instruction, though their education emphasized domestic skills, religious piety, and social graces more than intellectual development. While a few exceptional women like Elizabeth I received a humanist education, this was the exception rather than the rule. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge were the primary centers of higher learning. Attendance was restricted to those who could afford it and had received the requisite preparatory education. Students at these institutions studied theology, law, medicine, and the liberal arts, often with the intention of entering the clergy or serving the crown. University education was a gateway to power and influence, but it remained inaccessible to the vast majority of the population. The printing press, introduced in the late 15th century, began to change the educational landscape by making books more widely available. Literacy slowly increased, particularly in towns and among the merchant class. Religious texts, especially the Bible in English, encouraged reading among the laity, and pamphlets, ballads, and almanacs brought news and ideas to a broader audience. Still, Illiteracy remained widespread, and most people relied on oral tradition, sermons, and visual art for information and instruction. Social inequality permeated every corner of Tudor life. The institutions of monarchy, church, and land ownership all worked together to preserve the status quo. The law favored the wealthy, property determined one's influence, and access to education was tightly controlled. The poor had little recourse, and even those with talent and ambition faced steep barriers. Charity and patronage offered some relief, but they also reinforced dependency and the social order. Yet despite the rigid structure of Tudor society, it was not entirely static. Economic changes such as the rise of the wool trade and the enclosure of common lands created new forms of wealth and displacement. The Reformation disrupted traditional power structures and created new opportunities for some while leaving others adrift. The growing power of the gentry and the emergence of a literate middle class hinted at shifts that would transform English society in the centuries to come. Nevertheless, for most people, the Tudor world remained a place of strict boundaries and limited mobility. Your birth defined your destiny, your faith defined your loyalty, and your ignorance defined your place. Within this framework, people found meaning, stability, and a sense of belonging. They built communities, celebrated festivals, observed rituals, and endured hardship with patience and strength. The inequality they faced was not merely an economic condition, but a deeply embedded feature of their culture, sanctioned by religion, enforced by law, and reflected in every detail of their lives. In this world, power was visible and tangible. It was worn on the bodies of the nobility in silks and jewels, spoken in the Latin prayers of the educated, and etched into the land by stone manor houses and sprawling estates. It echoed in the sermons from the pulpit and in the silence of the unlettered laborer. Yet even among the poor and powerless, there existed dignity, courage, and a determination to survive. Tudor society, for all its inequities, was also a world of human resilience where the struggles of daily life were met with faith, family, and a shared commitment to endure. The Tudor era remains one of the most transformative periods in English history. It was an age of monumental change that not only reshaped the structure of English society but also set the stage for the emergence of modern Britain. The legacies of the Tudor monarchs Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I are deeply woven into the cultural, political, and intellectual fabric of the nation. These rulers oversaw an epoch that brought about profound religious reform, centralized power under the monarchy, encouraged the flowering of the arts, and laid the groundwork for England's future as a global power. Their legacy continues to influence England and the wider world in countless ways, from governance and religion to education and global relations. The political legacy of the Tudors was rooted in the stability they brought after decades of civil conflict. Henry VII emerged victorious at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, effectively ending the Wars of the Roses between the houses of Lancaster and York. His marriage to Elizabeth of York symbolically united the warring factions and brought a much-needed sense of unity to the country. Henry VII's rule marked the beginning of strong centralized monarchy, characterized by careful financial management and strategic diplomacy. He reduced the power of the nobility, stabilized the economy, and created a more efficient administration. His policies laid the groundwork for a more modern state apparatus, one less dependent on feudal allegiances and more reliant on a centralized bureaucracy. Henry VIII continued his father's policies of strong monarchical authority but is best remembered for a more dramatic contribution, the English Reformation. His break from the Roman Catholic Church and the establishment of the Church of England redefined the religious and political landscape of the nation. The dissolution of the monasteries not only ended centuries of papal authority in England but also resulted in the redistribution of vast amounts of land and wealth, enriching the crown and a new class of landowners. Though his motives were personal and political, securing a male heir and asserting sovereign independence from Rome, the long-term impact was revolutionary. It initiated a process of religious transformation that would lead to deep sectarian divisions but also foster a culture of debate, literacy, and eventually tolerance. The Reformation under Henry VIII and furthered by his successors, particularly under Edward VI and Elizabeth I, had profound consequences for English identity. Protestantism became not just a matter of private belief but a defining feature of English national character. The Tudor state became increasingly involved in enforcing religious conformity, leading to periods of persecution under both Catholic and Protestant rulers. Mary I's brief return to Catholicism and her violent suppression of Protestants created a lasting association between Catholicism and foreign interference, especially Spanish influence. Elizabeth I, though Protestant, took a more pragmatic approach, establishing the Elizabethan religious settlement which aimed to unify the country under a moderate Anglicanism. This created a distinct English church that balanced traditional rituals with Reformed doctrine, an institution that remains central to English society to this day. Beyond politics and religion, the Tudor legacy is perhaps most vividly remembered through its contributions to culture and the arts. The embrace of Renaissance humanism introduced new ways of thinking, placing emphasis on individual potential, classical learning, and critical inquiry. This intellectual movement, which had begun in Italy, found fertile ground in Tudor England, influencing education, literature, philosophy, and the arts. Humanist scholars like Thomas More and Erasmus advocated for moral and intellectual reform, emphasizing the study of ancient texts and languages. Grammar schools, often funded by Tudor patrons, flourished across the country, making education accessible to more than just the aristocracy. This laid the foundation for a more literate and intellectually engaged populace, although access remained largely limited by class and gender. One of the most enduring cultural legacies of the Tudors was the flowering of English literature and drama, most notably during the reign of Elizabeth I. The period saw the rise of literary giants like William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Edmund Spenser. Shakespeare's plays in particular have become universal cultural touchstones, exploring themes of power, identity, betrayal, and human nature in ways that continue to resonate today. The patronage of the arts by Elizabeth and the court created a vibrant cultural scene in London, with public theaters becoming major centers of entertainment and discourse. This democratization of culture, where the masses could attend performances alongside the gentry, was a revolutionary shift that has informed modern cultural consumption. The legacy of Tudor exploration and colonization is another key aspect of their historical significance. During the late Tudor period, England began to look beyond its shores, engaging in maritime exploration and early colonial ventures. Figures like Sir Francis Drake, Sir Walter Raleigh, and John Hawkins ventured across the Atlantic and around the globe, laying the foundations for what would become the British Empire. Though these efforts were initially limited and often driven by private enterprise rather than state policy, they marked the beginning of England's transformation into a global power. These voyages brought new wealth, knowledge, and goods to England, while also introducing the country to the brutal realities of empire, including the transatlantic slave trade and violent conflict with indigenous populations. The Tudors also contributed to the growth of national consciousness. The consolidation of power under the monarchy and the fostering of a distinct religious and cultural identity helped shape a sense of Englishness that transcended regional loyalties. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 under Elizabeth I was not just a military triumph but a symbolic assertion of national strength and divine favor. It reinforced Protestant England's sense of destiny and superiority over Catholic Europe, particularly Spain, and fueled the mythologizing of Elizabeth as the Virgin Queen, divinely ordained to lead her people. This burgeoning nationalism would become a powerful force in English history, influencing everything from politics to literature and shaping the national narrative for centuries. In terms of legal and governmental structures, the Tudors left a system that, while autocratic in many respects, laid the groundwork for future constitutional development. The use of Parliament evolved under the Tudors, particularly as monarchs increasingly turned to it for revenue and legal sanction for controversial policies. Although Parliament was not yet a co-equal branch of government, its role in taxation, legislation, and religious reform grew significantly. This gradual expansion of parliamentary power would later become a central issue in the English Civil War and the eventual establishment of constitutional monarchy. In this way, the Tudors helped to set in motion the processes that would lead to modern democratic governance. Another notable legacy was the transformation of the English economy and society through changes in land ownership, agriculture, and commerce. The dissolution of the monasteries, enclosure of common lands, and expansion of trade all contributed to the rise of a new class of wealthy landowners and merchants. These changes weakened the traditional feudal order and facilitated the emergence of a more dynamic, if unequal, economic system. Towns grew, markets expanded, and England began to integrate into the early modern global economy. These developments would pave the way for the later Industrial Revolution and the profound reshaping of English society in the centuries that followed. Even the visual and material culture of the Tudor period has had a lasting impact. The architecture of the time, including great houses, palaces, and public buildings, reflected both the power of the monarchy and the growing wealth of the gentry. Iconic structures like Hampton Court Palace and Hardwicke Hall symbolized the grandeur and ambition of the age. Tudor style, with its distinctive half-timbered buildings and elaborate brickwork, remains one of the most recognizable in English architectural history. In art, portraiture flourished under artists like Hans Holbein the Younger, who captured the likenesses of Tudor royalty and nobility with unprecedented realism. These images helped shape perceptions of monarchy, power, and identity that persist in the modern imagination. The Tudors also played a role in shaping gender norms and the roles of women in society, particularly through the reigns of queens like Mary I and Elizabeth I. Although Tudor society was patriarchal, the presence of female monarchs challenged contemporary assumptions about women's capabilities and roles. Elizabeth, in particular, used her gender strategically, crafting an image of herself as both a powerful ruler and a symbol of national unity. Her reign was marked by relative stability, effective governance, and cultural flourishing, earning her the admiration of many contemporaries and future generations. The example she set would be invoked in later debates about women's rights and leadership, making her a complex and enduring figure in the history of feminism and political thought. Education also saw a remarkable transformation during this period. With the rise of humanist ideals and the support of Tudor monarchs and nobles, educational opportunities expanded, at least for some. New schools were founded, universities grew in importance, and the curriculum shifted to include classical texts, moral philosophy, and rhetoric. Although the system remained exclusive and largely inaccessible to the lower classes and women, the groundwork was laid for more inclusive educational reforms in later centuries. The emphasis on learning, inquiry, and moral development that characterized Tudor humanism continues to inform educational values to this day. The religious legacy of the Tudors, particularly the establishment of Anglicanism, remains a defining feature of English cultural and political life. The Church of England, born out of Henry VIII's break with Rome, became more than just a religious institution. It became a cornerstone of English national identity. Its structure, rituals, and theology reflected a uniquely English synthesis of Catholic tradition and Protestant reform. Over time, this institution would evolve to accommodate a broad range of beliefs, helping to shape a society that values pluralism and tolerance. The debates and conflicts that arose during the Tudor Reformation continue to resonate in modern discussions about religious freedom, church-state relations, and moral authority. The intellectual legacy of the Tudor period is evident in the enduring influence of its thinkers and writers. The works of Thomas More, with his reflections on justice and governance in Utopia, and the political writings of figures like William Cecil and John Fox helped to shape English political philosophy. The printing press, which became widespread during this period, enabled the dissemination of new ideas, religious texts, and literature, fostering a more informed and engaged public. This transformation in communication and literacy contributed to the rise of public opinion and the gradual development of a more participatory political culture. Even in the realm of personal identity and self-expression, the Tudors left a lasting mark. The rise of portraiture, autobiographical writing, and literature that explored the complexities of individual experience reflected a growing awareness of personal identity. This was a significant shift from medieval conceptions of the self as defined primarily by social roles and religious obligations. The Renaissance emphasis on human potential and individual worth found fertile ground in Tudor England, contributing to a cultural environment in which creativity, ambition, and self-reflection were increasingly valued. The Tudor legacy is vast and multifaceted. It encompasses the consolidation of political power, the transformation of religious life, the flowering of culture and education, and the beginnings of global expansion. The decisions made by Tudor monarchs reverberated far beyond their lifetimes, shaping the political institutions, cultural norms, and intellectual currents that define modern England. While the era was marked by conflict, persecution, and inequality, it also witnessed remarkable progress and resilience. The Tudor period was not just a bridge between the medieval and modern worlds, it was the crucible in which the foundations of modern England were forged. The Tudor era, extending from the ascension of Henry VII in 1485 to the death of Elizabeth I in 1603, represents one of the most formative and enduringly influential periods in English history. The legacies left by the Tudor monarchs continue to resonate in the realms of politics, religion, culture, education, and global affairs, and understanding this era provides crucial insight into the development of modern England. In reflecting on the many dimensions of the Tudor legacy, it becomes clear that this period was not just defined by individual rulers or singular events, but by a profound transformation in the very fabric of English society. One of the most foundational aspects of the Tudor legacy was the consolidation of centralized royal authority. After decades of civil war under the Wars of the Roses, Henry VII's victory at Bosworth marked more than a shift in dynastic power, it marked the beginning of a more unified and stable governance model. His policies curbed the independence of the nobility and strengthened the crown's influence over law and finance. Henry VIII furthered this trajectory, centralizing power to an unprecedented degree through both political and religious channels. The monarch became not only the supreme political figure but also the head of the newly formed Church of England, marking a radical departure from centuries of papal supremacy. These developments redefined the relationship between ruler and subject, king and clergy, nation and religion. Religious transformation during the Tudor era was among the most dramatic and far-reaching. The English Reformation, initiated by Henry VIII's split from Rome and solidified through subsequent monarchs, permanently altered the religious identity of the nation. This break was not only a matter of theology, it had profound implications for governance, social structure and cultural life. The dissolution of monasteries redistributed immense wealth and land, changing the economic landscape and eroding traditional religious authority. The reigns of Edward VI, Mary I and Elizabeth I each brought new interpretations and policies that swung between Protestantism and Catholicism, causing confusion, persecution and upheaval. However, Elizabeth's establishment of the Anglican Church as a middle path between extremes provided a lasting religious settlement that continues to influence the structure and identity of the Church of England. In cultural terms, the Tudor period was a golden age. It saw the rise of humanist ideals and the flourishing of the English Renaissance. Education became more widespread among the gentry and emerging middle class, with grammar schools and universities promoting the study of classical texts, philosophy, and rhetoric. The printing press allowed for a greater circulation of books and ideas, encouraging public engagement with new concepts and religious debates. Intellectual life was not confined to scholars and clerics. Playwrights, poets, and artists contributed to a national cultural identity that celebrated wit, learning, and artistic expression. This period also witnessed one of the greatest literary flowerings in English history. The works of William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, and other luminaries of Elizabethan drama and poetry are a cornerstone of English literature and remain widely studied and performed around the world. Their writings explored the complexity of human nature, political power, and societal norms, often drawing on classical themes while grounding their stories in English settings and concerns. This cultural vitality helped define English identity and left a body of work that continues to shape literature and theatre globally. The Tudors also laid the groundwork for England's emergence as a maritime and imperial power. During Elizabeth I's reign, seafaring adventurers and privateers like Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh ventured across the globe, marking the beginnings of overseas exploration and colonization. Although these early efforts were limited in scale and often motivated by private enterprise rather than state planning, they set in motion a process that would ultimately lead to the vast expansion of British influence worldwide. These ventures were not without consequences. Indigenous populations were displaced or decimated, and the transatlantic slave trade took root during this time, but they marked the start of England's participation in global commerce, exploration, and colonization. The economic changes of the Tudor period also contributed to long-lasting shifts. The dissolution of the monasteries, alongside the enclosure of common lands, created a new class of landowners and capitalists who would become key players in the evolving market economy. While this brought prosperity to some, it also displaced many peasants, contributing to urban migration and the growth of poverty. The emerging capitalist structures, urbanization, and trade expansion laid the foundations for later economic developments, including industrialization. In this way, the Tudor period can be seen as the bridge between a feudal, agrarian past and a more modern, market-oriented future. Social structures during the Tudor era remained rigidly hierarchical, but they were also under subtle transformation. The increasing importance of education and commerce allowed some degree of social mobility, particularly for those outside the traditional aristocracy. While gender roles remained restrictive and education was largely confined to wealthy males, the reign of Elizabeth I itself posed a powerful challenge to conventional ideas about women and authority. Her reign as a female monarch in a patriarchal society, ruling without a husband and exercising formidable political and military power, became a powerful symbol of female leadership and political stability. Though her image was carefully crafted and mythologized, it had a lasting impact on perceptions of gender and governance. In the realm of art, architecture, and material culture, the Tudors left behind a rich visual legacy. The construction of grand palaces, estates, and public buildings reflected both royal ambition and the rising wealth of the gentry. Tudor architecture, with its signature timber-framed buildings and ornate brickwork, remains a defining feature of the English landscape. Artistic patronage, particularly under Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, produced memorable portraits that conveyed both the personality and power of the Tudor court. These images were more than aesthetic expressions, they were tools of political propaganda and identity formation. The use of portraiture to shape public perception, seen most famously in the iconic depictions of Elizabeth I, helped establish visual culture as a powerful medium for influence. The Tudors' legacy also includes lasting developments in law and governance. Though absolute in many ways, Tudor rule saw the increasing use of Parliament, particularly for matters of taxation and religious reform. This helped set precedents for the role of representative institutions in English government. The legal reforms and administrative centralization undertaken during this period made the government more efficient and laid the groundwork for future constitutional developments. These seeds would bear fruit in the following centuries, particularly during the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, leading ultimately to the establishment of a constitutional monarchy and the evolution of parliamentary democracy. What is perhaps most remarkable about the Tudor legacy is how it encompasses such a wide array of lasting influences. From the emergence of a national church to the rise of vernacular literature, from maritime exploration to educational reform, from political centralization to cultural blossoming, the Tudors initiated or accelerated processes that would shape not only England but also the wider world. Their period of rule represents a convergence of medieval traditions and modern aspirations, of old hierarchies and new possibilities, of faith and reason, tyranny and progress. The complexity of the Tudor legacy lies in its contradictions as much as its accomplishments. It was an age of intellectual awakening and brutal persecution, of creative genius and rigid conformity, of powerful queens and subjugated women, of exploration and exploitation. Yet it is precisely in this complexity that the enduring fascination with the Tudor period lies. It speaks to the human condition in all its multifaceted nature, striving, creating, questioning, and enduring. The Tudor era cannot be reduced to mere dates or monarchs. It was an age of transformation that forged the identity of a nation and set it on a course that would shape the modern world. Its legacy is not static, but dynamic, constantly reinterpreted through new perspectives and discoveries. The institutions, values, and cultural touchstones established during this period continue to influence English society centuries later. Whether in the enduring resonance of Shakespeare's words, the rituals of the Anglican Church, the architecture that dots the countryside, or the national memory of a golden age, the imprint of the Tudors is indelible. They left a legacy that is not only remembered but lived, and that legacy is, perhaps, their greatest achievement.